Pachios on the News is sponsored by the law offices of Pretty Flaherty, located at One City Center in Portland, Maine, with offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts.
Good evening to tonight's segment of Pachios on the News and Public Access Television in southern Maine. We have a very special guest tonight, and one we're very excited to present to the people of this state and particularly of southern Maine, a very famous journalist, Bill Moyers. Bill, thanks very much for agreeing to join us.
It's my pleasure, Hal.
I ought to tell the folks watching this that you and I go back a long time. They'll never believe this of me, that I've had a friendship going back 48 years. They don't think I'm that old.
I do.
But Bill and I do go back a very long way, simply because he was good enough to hire me twice. Once when he was associate and then deputy director of the Peace Corps in its very earliest days, at the very beginning, and then later when he became White House press secretary. We don't have a lot of time with Bill, and I want to get going now and talk to him a little. He knows a little bit about public access television. In fact, a lot. He's done a lot for public access television. He knows it's very low budget television. They call themselves at our station, Bill, free speech television. And some call you the conscience of American journalism. Any thought to begin this show on the role of public access television in America?
Well, first, I've never called myself the conscience of television. That was a term used by a critic for the Christian Science Monitor many years ago, and I curdled when I read it in print because I knew I would never live it down. Yes, you know, the conversation of democracy requires many voices, and for far too long in this country, the voices on television have been determined by corporate interests, by what reaches the largest audience to deliver the most eyeballs to advertisers. And that has meant that a lot of voices in this country are marginalized. Voices that come from the left or the right, voices that challenge the consensus of society, voices that are skeptical of official policy, voices that don't adhere to the groupthink that so often dominates American politics, American business, and American life. So public access across the country is a place where people like you and your viewers can have the conversation you want to have without regard to commercial motives, without regard to making a profit. So I've been a long-time advocate, as an advocate of free speech and the First Amendment, of public access television, of low-power radio, small radio stations that may reach only a mile or two, but nonetheless cover issues and ideas that are of interest to local people. So I think public access is a small but important, potent voice for people like your viewers in communities like Portland and the towns around you.
Your journalism is really focused on ideas, Bill, and history. I noticed that a lot of your discussion with your guests and the journalism you do, it focuses on history. An initial question: do you read a lot?
I do read a lot. I read a lot out of professional necessity because I'm interviewing people who've written books or who are coming from the world of ideas, and I need to know what they've said, what they're thinking. Yes, I read a lot and for my work, but I also read a lot for my own idle pleasure.
For decades, we've been in America. We've been watching your interviews, your documentaries. I think you've done you've probably done over 1,000 hours of television all told, which is a lot, I think. And I don't want to make you blush, and we'll get over this.
You can't make me blush. How you tried? You tried 40 years ago, and I never blushed.
But we're going to get over this quickly to put you back at ease. But I think that you have more Emmys than anyone around. I think you have more than 30 Emmys. So your shows are interesting, and they get attention, and they have impact. How do you decide what to do? Where do these ideas for shows come from?
You know, the editor of the very first newspaper in America, 1691, in New England. It was called Public Occurrences, both Foreign and Domestic. And his name was Harris. And he said, my mandate is to give an account of such considerable things as have come to my attention. And I think that's what we journalists are obliged to do and are privileged to do. If we have the kind of freedom I have had on public broadcasting, to be able to say, you know, that's a very interesting story, I'd like to report it, or that's a very fascinating book, I'd like to talk to the author about it, or this is an idea that's emerging in culture, and I've seen it pop its head above its gopher's hole, and I'd like to pull it out of there and address it. Public affairs, I've always been able to take a very large notion of public affairs. It's not just government, it's not just politics, it's culture and art, it's religion, it's foreign affairs, it's anything that affects our world and our perception of the world and our role in the world. So I've been very fortunate, mainly because I've been all of these years in public broadcasting with a few detours to CBS a couple of times. I've been able to follow my intuition about what's important and what's interesting. I miss at times. You know, in sport, in baseball, if you bat a third at 333, you're going to make a lot of money. In our business, you have to bat at least 500, and I've been lucky, I think, more or less to bat 500. But I've hit some. I've struck out a lot too.
And a lot of it revolves around people's stories, the stories that people tell you. Isn't that true? I mean, I get that impression that you listen to people and you hear stories, and the stories illustrate the ideas that are churning within you.
Well, I grew up in a small town in the South, as you know, and when you grow up in a small town in East Texas, which is a very Southern culture, I mean, I would lie in bed at night and hear my mother and father in the next bedroom talking. My bed was only we had a very small two-bedroom house. It was only a few feet from the street. And so when I was lying in bed at night, I could hear the neighbors, the Mangers across the street or the Bergens across the other street. I could hear them in the night talking. People would be coming home from the movies at night, and I could hear their voices telling stories as they came down the street. I remember my mother's voice as she and Mrs. Platt, our next-door neighbor, would lean across the fence and tell stories about their children and their nephews and their nieces, or just about the town. So as David Brinkley once said to me, the late David Brinkley, he said, you can't grow up in the South without resonating with stories. Everybody has a story. And of course, we read all the stories in the Bible many, many times. So stories became sort of the ID of people. The stories became the way you knew who someone was, and the way information was communicated and transmitted. So as a Southerner, I grew up with voices in my ears. I used to go down on Saturday to the courthouse square. In those days, Marshall was a 50% black and 50% white town and totally segregated. And
Marshall, Texas.
That's right. And on Saturdays, you could go down and all the black farmers were on the west side of the courthouse and all the white farmers were on the east side of the courthouse, and I would just circulate among them. In those days, believe it or not, people came to town in wagons. They brought their fruit, their produce.
I knew you were old.
Yeah, well, I am. And I just circulate on the town square listening to the voices of the black farmers, the white farmers, the Jewish and Syrian merchants who owned the stores around the square. My head was crowded with stories.
It's interesting because when I worked with you at the White House, we had a lot of journalists that were Southern born and bred. And I remember Doug Kiker telling me, look at Wicker, look at me. We all grew up in the South hearing stories. And also the Baptist tradition. I mean, people, now you come from the Baptist tradition. There was a lot of talking in those Baptist churches.
Yeah, I think that's where I learned about democracy, was in a Baptist church, because everyone, young and old, was privileged to speak, to offer your opinion. You know, Baptists believe in the priesthood of the believer. That is, each of us is the editor of our own interpretation of the story. We grew up with the story. The story was the biblical story, from Adam and Eve right through the angels in the book of Revelation. It was all one big story, filled with characters. You couldn't escape stories if you were living in a culture like that. And in our church, you know, everyone gave testimony, everyone gave the equivalent of a Catholic confession, but we didn't do it in a booth, we did it publicly. Sermon after sermon, Sunday after Sunday, the best sermons were stories. Yeah. I went to the University of Edinburgh because I wanted to study under a great divine named James Stewart, who was the best preacher in Europe of his time. And his sermons began and ended with stories. They were themselves parables. So you just can't be a journalist with that tradition who doesn't understand the most important thing somebody has to tell you is a story.
You've been labeled by many, Karl Rove and some people like that label you this age, liberal journalists. The so-called progressives, they claim you as their own. How do you think of yourself in terms of, do you think a label applies?
Well, I sometimes would fit a label, and sometimes the label would not fit me. The fact of the matter is, I think that experience is where we get our most important lessons and make our most important judgments. And I've often said something that Lyndon Johnson used to say to me often: every experience creates a new reality. So yesterday's ideology, yesterday's true beliefs, yesterday's known world could disappear overnight given new worlds, new evidence, new arrivals. So, I mean, I'm a liberal in the sense that I believe that together, actively, as a government of and by and for the people, we can do things that the market can't do for us. The market doesn't deliver good public schools. It doesn't deliver good public libraries. It doesn't deliver anything but commercial television.
It doesn't even deliver a good economy.
No, well, that's exactly right. Just as the true believers of communism decided that their utopian vision of the economic order was worthless, so we've learned that a utopian vision of the free market is worthless. I take my conclusions from studying the evidence. That's what a good journalist should be. But I am a liberal in the sense that I believe in an affirmative government. I was born in the New Deal. My father's great regret, as he told me near the end of his death, was that he didn't have a fifth chance to vote for Franklin Roosevelt. He never met Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt didn't know my father. But this patrician could reach this truck driver in East Texas because he made government my father's friend. And I still believe that government is capable of great mistakes or great inadequacies. Look at FEMA. Look at the Veterans Administration, which has been failing to serve the veterans who come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. The government is, like everything, needs checks and balances. I'm a liberal in the sense that I believe in a market. I believe in the free markets, but I believe the free markets work best when they're regulated and governed by certain principles and watchdogs. So in that sense, I am a liberal, but, you know, I've been married to the same woman for 54 years. I've been going back to the same community for 70 some odd years. Culturally and socially, I think of myself as a conserver of values, a conserver of institutions, and, you know, put whatever label on me that seems to apply.
I think you're defined by your story, because we're now into your story, which is where I wanted to go with this interview. And you've talked a little bit about Marshall and blacks and whites in Marshall. And I think one of the greatest shows you ever did was Marshall, Texas, two Marshall, Texases.
Yeah, the black Marshall and the white Marshall. And by the way, I wasn't that aware of it growing up. I said in that show that the reason I wanted to do this documentary, it is one of the most popular I've ever done, is because it shows you how you can grow up well-loved, well-churched, and well-taught, and still be indifferent to the realities of other people's experience. I mean, I knew there were blacks in our town. I knew we were a segregated town. I didn't feel their pain. I didn't understand their dilemma. I didn't understand what it was like to be a second-class citizen, because I was the beneficiary of affirmative action for white boys. I mean, I was very poor. My father never made over $100 a week in his life, except the last week he worked, and I still have the paycheck after taxes. It was $96.25. That's the most he ever made in his life. But I didn't grow up black. So while I could understand the impact of being poor on your life, I couldn't understand the impact of color on your life. It was only much later. It was really in Washington that I began to see the world from the perspective of the person I hadn't been able to understand or recognize when I was a kid growing up in Marshall.
And the story continued after Marshall. You became an intern. I think you were 19 years old in the Senate, interning for Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who was then, I believe, the majority leader.
Yeah, I was 20, actually. I had written him a letter out of the blue. He read it and hired me we had no such things as interns in those days. Everybody who worked for Lyndon Johnson was an indentured servant, no matter what your age. So I went up and spent the summer in his mailroom in the Senate when he was the majority leader of the Senate, just because at that time I had said I want to be a political journalist. And I wrote him and said, you know, I know something about young people in Texas, and you know something about politics. Let me come and work for you so I can learn how to be a political journalist. And I got the job.
You got the job, and apparently you did the job because then he wanted to haul you into his circle and keep you there. Isn't that true?
Yes, and that was a simple fact that I knew how to write letters. In those days, you know, you'd take the letter that was written to the Senate Majority Leader or the United States Senator, and you would answer it. You would do the first draft, and then it would go to an administrative assistant and then to a secretary.
Incidentally, I know how that works because I did it for you. Go ahead.
You did it. You know, you would, so when the letter went over to LBJ, the Senate Majority Leader, from the Senate office building to his office in the Capitol, it would have the letter, which he would sign, and underneath it would have a carbon of the letter. Carbons have gone out of fashion, and that would have the initials that would say LBJ, MV, the secretary, and then BDM. And I was the one I was the BDM. I had written the letter for him, and he liked my letters. And sooner or later, he called me over and put me outside of his desk, his office, and said, "You write my letters." So I was writing letters to Dwight Eisenhower, the President of the United States, to members of the government and important people around the country, which he signed. But that's how he and I became close, is he liked my letters. To this day, I say to young people, don't email me, don't call me. If you want to get my attention, sit down and write me a letter. I'll know more about you from your letter than I would ever learn, in fact, from just sitting across the room from you. I'll learn about you when I sit across the room from you, but your first introduction to me is a letter. And that's how many of the people who worked with me over the years have written me a letter. You didn't. You were too busy in law school to write a letter.
We talked a lot.
Yeah, we talked a lot.
Bill, another piece of the story was you left Washington, you went back to school then to the University of Texas, but then ultimately to the seminary to become a minister. And that's, I think, an important part of the story because you had a theological education. Did you before I go on and ask you about this, did you have a church after you graduated?
Well, the summer that I spent in Washington was a disillusioning summer, despite my experience with Senate Majority Leader Johnson. I was living alone. I was new to Washington. I knew no one. And it was the time of the McCarthy hearings. And I saw the ugliness surrounding those hearings. You know, Senator Joe McCarthy was coming apart, quite frankly, after his long campaign to identify traitors in government and his accusations against innocent people. And that was disillusioning. And then one Sunday afternoon, when I was working alone in my office in the Senate office building, Sunday afternoon, beautiful day outside, I heard a report, a noise, a sound. I didn't know what it was. I kept working. Then I heard feet on the marble stairs, those great marble stairs in the Senate office building. And I opened my door and looked out, and there were Capitol Police running up the stairs to the floor above me. And a United States Senator from Wyoming named Hunt had committed suicide right there that Sunday afternoon above my office. We didn't know why at the moment. I mean, I saw them bring the body down, take it out to the ambulance, and nobody knew why. What was it? Turns out that we learned fairly soon that his son had been outed as a queer, is what they were called, as homosexual. Yeah. And he, given the fact that that was a cause for public shame in those days, wrongly, but it was, he couldn't face the attention that he was going to come to him because of his son's being outed as a gay man, and he took his life. There's now been a book written about him. That was disillusioning. So when I went back to Texas after this summer, despite the fact that I had flourished in the friendship of President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, Senator Johnson, I decided, you know, I'm not going to have any influence in Washington. That's not what I really want to do. So what I did was to decide, I was still at the University of Texas, to go to seminary to do a master's in divinity because I thought, frankly, I would teach. When I got out of seminary, I'd finish my PhD, which I had started at the University of Texas, and I would finish it, and I'd wind up teaching in a religious institution. I didn't. During that time I was doing my graduate work, I did go out and inflict my opinions and views upon the parishioners of small congregations in the central part of Texas. I was not a very good preacher. They were a very loyal, attentive congregation. And many years ago, we left the house we'd lived in for a quarter of a century. I found a lot of the outlines of those sermons in the attic as I was cleaning out the house. I looked at them and said, oh my God, forgive me for what I did to those poor folks. But that was a very definitive period. All of my little congregations were in the oil fields of Oklahoma or in the peanut patches of central Texas. Those were salt of the earth people, both the riggers working in the oil fields and the farmers. They were so tolerant of me. They were so charitable toward me. They were so kind toward me. What did I know about what I was saying from the lectern? But they took us home for lunch. They cared for Judith and our then young son, whom you know, now 50 years old. And it was a reminder that beyond theology and ideology, there are people's lives. And that's what really matters.
And the story continues, and it has such bright colors and such contrast from those small towns where they grew peanuts, and you preached on Sunday, to back to Washington in a presidential campaign with Senator Johnson, campaigning for president. And you were his close aide. He asked you to come, and you traveled all over the country with him, didn't you?
I was packing up to leave after I got my degree from the seminary. I was packing up to return to the University of Texas to finish my doctorate, and the phone rang, and it was Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, 6 years after I'd worked for him in 1954, saying that he was going to make a run for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1960. And he said, I'm not going to get it, but I want to do it. I want to run. And so I need you to come and help me out. And I went, and I was one of many, but he had me at his right hand, doing anything that came up. I wasn't a policy advisor. I was a factotum.
But you were at his side.
Yeah, I was at his side. And in Washington, proximity is power. I mean, David Axelrod is sitting in the tiniest little office down the corridor from President Obama. But because he's there and not across the street in the executive office building, he has more power than anybody.
I have too much to extract from you, and I got to move this a little quicker, unfortunately. But so now you get to the convention. You're fairly close to Senator Johnson. I know you were close. Everybody knows you were close. Were you around when he was asked to be the vice presidential running mate? And if you were around, how close were you?
I was in the bathroom of the Ambassador Hotel suite where we were staying when John F. Kennedy came to the suite. I actually opened the door. I was sleeping in the bathroom. That's where I slept in those days during the convention, if we slept at all. I had spread my pallet out on the bathroom, and the phone rang about early in the morning. And to this day, I still answer a phone on the first ring because that's what Lyndon Johnson taught us. If it rings past one ring, you may have lost the customer. So you answer it. And so I thought I would get to the phone first in the hotel room, but Lady Bird picked it up. They were in the bedroom together. She was asleep. He was asleep. And I heard her as I came in the door saying, Lyndon, it's Jack, Senator Kennedy. And so LBJ woke up and listened to the voice, and then he hung up and he said he wants to come see me. And Lady Bird said, I hope you won't do it. And they were talking about the vice president. They didn't ever mention it. He just said, well, I'm going to hear him out. So I actually opened the door when John F. Kennedy came in, but I did not. I stayed around the corner and I did not sit in on the conversation.
I heard snatches.
I heard snatches of it, and all I can remember for certain is that John Kennedy was very certain he wanted Lyndon Johnson to run with him. And why wouldn't it? He knew it was going to be a close race. He needed Texas. He needed a couple of states in the South. He could get it. Johnson was a towering figure in Texas and in the Senate, and John F. Kennedy, like Barack Obama, was very young at that time. He was not even 41, I think, or 40, maybe 42. He was the youngest president elected since Teddy Roosevelt, so that would have made him 43 when he took the oath of office. And so he needed this man. His brother didn't want him because his brother thought Johnson was too liberal and too Southern. But when he left that room, I was sure that he had communicated to Johnson he really wanted him to run, and that LBJ was going to do it. Lady Bird didn't want him to do it. Sam Rayburn didn't want him to do it. John Connally didn't want him to do it. All of his close advisors didn't want him to do it.
So he became vice president, and I'm moving fast now in this colorful story. But then they won, and Johnson became vice president, and you were very close to him. And instead of doing what most of us would do, say, well, I'm going to go to work and be kind of a big shot with the vice president of the United States, you refused to do that. You wanted to do something else.
Well, during the campaign, my job was liaison between the two airplanes, Johnson's Swoosh and Kennedy's Caroline. Those are the names of the planes. And my job was to keep the two campaigns in touch and the two principals in touch. So I got to know a lot of the Boston Mafia. And I liked them, and they liked me. Austin to Boston was the mantra in those days, and there were a few of us in Texas who could speak to the Boston Mafia and interpret them back to the Irish, to the Texas Mafia, and I was one of them for reasons I don't know. Maybe it's this whole story, this whole issue we're talking about stories. But anyway, that was my job, and during the campaign, when I heard John F. Kennedy make the speech about the Peace Corps, it echoed a speech that I had written for LBJ 2 weeks before that he delivered at the University of Nebraska, 11th of October, 1960, in which we proposed a youth corps. Because that word was in currency then. Senator Humphrey was pushing a youth corps. Milton Schaap, the mayor of Philadelphia, was pushing a youth corps. Everybody was, and it infected me. It attracted my enthusiasm. So when Johnson was named vice president, I was up in that same office, sitting outside his vice president's door as his administrative assistant. But it was dull work. I mean, vice president had nothing to do in those days. And so therefore, we didn't have much to do. And when Kennedy announced that Sergeant Shriver, his brother-in-law, was going to organize this new Peace Corps, I knew that that's what I wanted to do. It took a lot of finagling on my part to persuade LBJ, the vice president, and JFK, the president, to let me go, because both of them knew I was a link between their two often suspicious worlds. And I had to really I went to the publisher of the Washington Post, Phil Graham, who was a good friend of both men. He lobbied for me. I went to a couple of other people who were influential with both of them. Finally, I was able to get away, and in March...
You were 25 or 26 years old, right?
I was 25, I think.
25 years old.
So finally, both of them agreed, and I went to help organize the Peace Corps.
And then we have so much we could talk about, but we have to skip whole time. You were at the Peace Corps until November 22nd, 1963. And on that day, that was your last day at the Peace Corps. Tell us what happened.
Well, very quickly, I was Deputy Director of the Peace Corps. John F. Kennedy had named me to help Sergeant Shriver run the Peace Corps after we'd organized it. Shriver and I had called on every member of Congress to sell it, because Congress was very skeptical that young people could go out in the world and do anything. So we called on every member of Congress. And then I became the Deputy Director of the Peace Corps. We sold the bill to them. And I was in my office one day, and the phone rang. It was Kenneth O'Donnell, who was President Kennedy's top political man. He said, Bill, the President's going to Texas to raise money and sort of fly the flag for his re-election campaign next year. Texas was in trouble. Kennedy was in trouble in Texas. And he said the Democrats in Texas are fighting each other. The Yarber people, Senator Yarber, were opposing the Connally people. The Connally people were opposing the Yarber people. The Johnson people were suspicious of everybody, and it was it was a hornet's nest. And the Italian American, a good friend of mine, Jerry Bruno, Italian American from Boston, had been sent down to advance the trip, and he didn't speak Texan, didn't understand Texas politics. So Kenny O'Donnell said, "We'd like you to go down and just hold everybody's hands until president gets out of the state. And I said to him, you know, I can't. The Peace Corps is apolitical, and I'm Deputy Director of the Peace Corps. I can't go and involve myself in partisan politics. Kenny O'Donnell said, okay. So about 30 minutes later, the phone rang. It was President Kennedy. And he said, Bill, I hear you don't want to go to Texas. And I said, that's right, Mr. President. Peace Corps is not involved in politics. He said, I'll tell you what, you go to Texas and worry about politics, and I'll stay in Washington and worry about the Peace Corps. So I was in Texas 24 hours later, and I was there. It was a successful trip. I did my work. I held hands, and I tried to reconcile the different factions, and I was celebrating with the chairman of the State Democratic Executive Committee, Frank Irwin, and the soon-to-be Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Ben Barnes, at the 40 Acres Club at the University of Texas, when I had a call from Bill Payne, who was the Secret Service agent in charge in Dallas, with whom I had worked. I was in Austin, the president was in Dallas, and he said, there's been a shooting, the president's hurt. So I then called a newsman I know, and within 20 minutes had raced out to the airport. We got a plane from the State Highway Department, and I was halfway between Austin and Dallas when the word came that JFK had died. So the plane landed at Love Field, and I got in a police car to go to Parkland Hospital, where I thought the new president, Vice President Johnson, about to be President Johnson, he'd already become President Johnson, in effect, was. It turned out he was on the Air Force One, which had been the plane beside which mine had landed when I arrived in Dallas. So I went over to the ramp, and the Secret Service agent stopped me, and I wrote a little note, Mr. President, I'm here if you need me. The agent took it up to the plane, came back a moment and motioned me up, and I was there when President Johnson was sworn in by Sarah Hughes, the judge, and I was on the flight back, and I stayed with him the next 3.5 years.
You actually stayed at his house that night, didn't you?
First 4 nights, yeah. We were at his house.
Now, we're running out of time, which is highly unfortunate for me and particularly for my listeners. But you were essentially the chief of staff and then the press secretary.
Briefly the chief of staff.
Yeah, and then the press secretary, and you...
The job I had, the job I most enjoyed in the White House, I was responsible for the task forces that put together the president's legislative program in 1964. The Environmental Acts, the Civil Rights Acts, the health provisions, the Education Acts, all that. Yeah. That's the job that I most enjoyed. That was the substantive job that gave me a great sense of satisfaction.
And you were close to the president, and I want to just ask you one thing about those days in the White House. There's 100 things to ask you about. But is the story true that when the second Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, was passed, Larry O'Brien called you from the Hill and said the Senate has passed it, and you called the president to congratulate him on the second Civil Rights Act passage, and he paused and said something to you about politics?
No, history does strange things to our memories, but that was the first act. It was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the one that ended discrimination in public facilities, restaurants, bathrooms, parks, things like that. Public Accommodations Act. And the day he signed it was a great day, and everybody was there in the White House, and it was a celebratory day. I went to the president's bedroom that night. My job included the last thing I did every night, 10 or 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, I'd take his night reading to him so that while he was in his bedroom overnight, he could read the memos that he needed to see. I walked in about 10:15 or so, and he was lying in bed looking very disconsolate with the covers pulled up to his chin. He looked depressed. And I said, Mr. President, what? And across his chest was the bulldog edition of the Washington Post. The headline was something to the effect, President signs historic bill. And I said, this is a great day. You should really be jubilant, but what's wrong? You seem troubled. And he said, I think that we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for my lifetime, and then he paused, knowing I was a much younger man, and yours. What he meant by that was he anticipated that there'd be a backlash. And that whereas the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party, had been the party behind the emancipation of the black man and woman, that it had passed that mantle now to the Democrats. And that the Democrats had in the 1960s become the party of emancipation. the Party of Liberation, and that the white former Democrats who were racists and segregationists would go to the Republican Party, and the Republican Party would welcome them as their new constituency. And he was right about that, because since then, the Republican Party's base has been, in fact, fastened on the Deep South. Today, it's basically a party of the Deep South. If you look at a map of America, you'll see the Republicans' strength is in those few old Confederate states. And it began in 1964 when Johnson knew there'd be a backlash at reaching out and embracing blacks as a main constituency of the Republican Party, of the Democratic Party.
Johnson wasn't very happy when you left the White House. He didn't want you to leave. You left, and you went to be publisher of Newsday. You didn't talk after that, I don't think. And I know that Mrs. Johnson was very concerned about it. I don't know whether you're comfortable, you know, acknowledging what happened and her concerns.
Well, I wasn't sure exactly. I still am not sure exactly what happened. There was a great deal of misunderstanding, and a lot of people spread, you know. For example, I was coming to be president, to be publisher of Newsday here in New York, and Bobby Kennedy was the senator, junior senator from New York. So out of courtesy, I called him up, we went to lunch, and I informed him that I was coming to be publisher of New York, publisher of Newsday here in New York. Somebody saw us coming out of the Sans Souci restaurant and immediately called Drew Pearson, the columnist and official
political gossip.
Political gossip, yeah, in Washington. And Drew Pearson called the president. He said, guess what? Moyers was just seen coming out of Sans Souci with Robert Kennedy. Now, the irony is that Johnson had sent me up to the Hill over and over again to negotiate with Bobby Kennedy over his opposition to the war and that sort of thing. And I had simply done a courtesy of informing the senator from New York that I was coming to his state. LBJ thought that Bobby Kennedy got me that job as publisher. He thought I'd gone over to the enemy's camp.
Yeah.
And he actually thought that Bobby Kennedy had gotten me the job with the owner of Newsday, who was a radical opponent of Bobby Kennedy. I mean, but that word spread, and Johnson didn't forgive me for that and other things, I think.
And but later on, there was I know Mrs. Johnson wanted there to be a rapprochement, and actually after he passed away just a few years ago, she asked you to come to Texas and to talk about him.
Yeah, I went down and laid the wreath at his grave on his 98th birthday, and that's when she asked me to deliver her eulogy. And so I said, of course I would. And when she died, 2 years later, 2 years ago, I went down and gave the eulogy. She was a great woman, a strong woman, a woman who stuck by her man and made him a better man for it. And she and we had been very good friends and soulmates in the White House. But you know, all we've talked about really was just a few years in my life, because I've spent the last 40 years as a journalist. And people often say to me, they often rather talk about my experience in Washington than my experience the last 40 years as a journalist. The experience in Washington informed me. I mean, it's very hard for me to read a story and not read between the lines, because I've been inside. And I know what's meant by language and what's not meant by language. And it was that experience which actually liberated me to be a journalist. It showed me that I didn't want to spend my life in government. It showed me I wasn't a very partisan man. I mean, I loved government. I didn't particularly care for politics, even though that's where I cut some of my teeth. But that experience, those 7 years in the Peace Corps and the White House, were actually the best education I could have had for understanding public life and understanding how democracy really works. It also did something else. You know, after I'd spent 5 years doing my master's in theology, divinity, I regretted that. When I met you, you were a young lawyer, and I said to myself, that's what I should have done with those 4 years. I should have prepared to be a lawyer, because it would be more practical than having spent those years in seminary and then wound up in Washington. If I'd had legal training as you did, a law school education as you did, I thought I'd be far more understanding and adept in public affairs. I was wrong about that, because those 4.5 years I spent getting my divinity, my master's in divinity, proved anticipatory of what's happened in the last 40 years, in which almost every issue of democracy converges at an ethical and religious intersection. And so we've had the rise of the religious right. We had all of these issues of separation of church and state. We have ethical issues at every step of the big decisions we're facing today and trying to reboot capitalism. So those, my subject, my major in ethics, my major in seminary was social ethics. And that proved to be a great device for interpreting the world of politics and government and economics and journalism.
Last question. Focusing for a moment on this horrible economic mess. American journalists, American media have any responsibility for this? And I ask that question because 2 years ago, in one of your speeches, you quoted you quoted a fellow named Norton Garfinkel, the American dream versus the gospel of wealth, and you said, quoting him in your speech, when the richest nation in the world has to borrow hundreds of billions of dollars to pay its bill, when its middle-class citizens sit on a mountain of debt to maintain their living standards, when the nation's economy has difficulty producing secure jobs or enough jobs of any kind, something is amiss, and then you launched into it. You said, yes, something is amiss. That was 2 years ago. The stock market was soaring, and you said that. So well, journalism missed the boat.
You can't be a son of the New Deal without recognizing that markets left to their own appetites will ultimately consume themselves. They will eat themselves. That capitalism works best when it has rules and when it has restraints and when it accepts those rules. You just know that's what led to the first Great Depression in this country, to the Great Depression of the 1930s, and you can't be a son of the New Deal without recognizing that. Look, it took me a while after I left the White House to realize that for the journalist, it's not how close you are to power that counts, it's how close you are to reality. And we journalists should be loyal to reality, not to power. And in the last 30 years, the press became too close to power, whether it was the Clinton administration or the Johnson administration or the Nixon to the Reagan administration. The press needs to be independent, both of groupthink in the public and groupthink to power. And we became the press, the main journal. There are a lot of great independent journalists in this country, and there's a lot of world-class journalism done in this country. But by and large, once the press became owned by huge mega corporations with interest in Washington, that trickled down, and the press became too close to the interest of wealth and power and was not able to keep a distance that separated itself from power and looked at reality. So yes, we have a big responsibility. The business press for the last 30 years, which bought into the gospel of wealth, the mainstream press, which turned from doing stories about ordinary people to doing stories about celebrities, the growth of the ideological press, which is designed to carry out a partisan agenda. You know, I'm talking about Fox News and talk radio. They've forgotten that the first the mandate of every journalist is to keep in mind the people who have no power and who have no access. And our job is to tell them what they need to know in order to hold power accountable. It's not to be a party to power. You know, I watched the funeral of my good friend who had been for so long the moderator of Meet the Press, and I saw all the people of power turn out for that funeral, and I really liked him a whole lot and admired him a lot. But I said, you know, if at my funeral people in power should show up, I would have failed to do my job as a journalist, and I think that's where we should take our stand.
Bill Moyers, with that, I just want to tell you how much we appreciate it. I think people of our part of Maine appreciate very much. having this opportunity to get to know you. And I appreciate the last 48 years of friendship. Thanks.
Same here, and if I get invited to Portland, I'll come and we'll finish this. I'll interview you for a change. I mean, you've got quite a life story.
This has now been recorded that you've agreed to come to Portland, Maine someday, and we're waiting for that.
All right.
Thanks very much, Bill.
Thanks, Al.